Imagine this. 34-year-old soldier, born not into privilege but into struggle, standing at the crossroads of history. While the world's most powerful nations tighten their grip on Africa, one man rises from the shadows not with riches, not with armies of his own, but with an unshakable belief that his people deserve freedom. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. To the West, he is a threat. To his people, he is a symbol of hope. At an age when most are still building their careers, Traoré is rewriting Africa's destiny. He is not just Africa's youngest president, he is the man daring to challenge centuries of exploitation, control, and silence. This is not just a political story, it is a story of rebellion against the old world order, of courage against impossible odds, and of a generation that refuses to bow. Today we uncover how a young captain shook the foundations of global power and became the voice of Africa's freedom. Ibrahim Traoré was not born into power. He was a soldier in the Burkina Faso army, a young man who believed his duty was to protect his people. But in 2022, when his country faced chaos, corruption, and foreign interference, Traoré made a decision that would change not only his life, but the entire direction of Burkina Faso. At just 34 years old, he became the youngest head of state in Africa, a title that shocked the world. But his leadership was never just about age. It was about courage. It was about standing up to powerful nations who had treated Africa like a colony for far too long. For some, he is a dangerous rebel challenging the international order. For others, he is a hero, giving Africa a new voice in a world dominated by Western interests. Whether loved or hated, one thing is certain. His story is a turning point in Africa's struggle for independence in the modern era. The year was 2022. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the heart of West Africa, was collapsing under the weight of its crises. Armed insurgencies tore through villages, schools were burned down, and thousands of families were forced to flee their homes. Hunger was everywhere, fear was constant, and hope was fading. The people no longer trusted their leaders, who seemed more concerned with pleasing foreign powers than protecting their own citizens. And then, in the middle of this darkness, a young captain stepped forward, a man named Ibrahim Traoré. At only 34 years old, he was not a career politician. He had no family dynasty to lean on, no international backers to fund his rise. He was a soldier, forged in the dust of battlefields where he fought alongside ordinary men who had nothing but their courage. He witnessed the despair of his people and the betrayal of leaders who allowed foreign powers to dictate the nation's destiny. For him, the breaking point had arrived. Traoré believed that Burkina Faso could no longer survive under the shadow of failed leadership. And so, with the eyes of the nation unknowingly watching, he made a daring decision to seize power and rewrite the course of his country's history. The coup of 2022 wasn't just a change in government. It was a spark, a thunderclap that echoed across Africa. Overnight, Ibrahim Traoré became the youngest president on the continent. Critics in the West rushed to call him reckless, impulsive, and unfit for leadership. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, people danced, cheered, and raised his image high. For them, Traoré wasn't just another politician. He was the embodiment of defiance, a man who had dared to say what many African leaders feared: enough is enough. His first actions as president made his vision clear. He turned his back on the lingering influence of France, the former colonial power that had long held tight control over Burkina Faso's resources and security. French troops who had been stationed in the country for years were told to leave. Military bases that symbolized dependency were closed. In their place, Traoré sought new partnerships, alliances based not on exploitation, but on mutual respect. This was not an easy path. By rejecting the West, Traoré invited a storm of criticism and threats. International institutions warned of sanctions. Western leaders accused him of destabilizing democracy, and media outlets across Europe painted him as a dangerous figure. Yet the young president stood firm. To him, this wasn't just politics, and it was survival. He understood something powerful. If Burkina Faso was to rise, it had to first break free from the invisible chains of neo-colonialism. His message was clear and bold. Africa must belong to Africans. But Traoré's struggle wasn't only against foreign powers. It was also a battle to win the hearts of his own people. He walked among citizens, spoke to farmers, and listened to students. He wasn't hiding behind palace walls. He was out in the dust and heat, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had been forgotten. And this built him something no foreign power could break: legitimacy in the eyes of his nation. Still, the risks were immense. Challenging the West was like standing in front of a giant. Powerful nations had toppled leaders for far less. The threats of coups, sanctions, and sabotage hung over him constantly. History had shown that those who opposed global powers often paid the ultimate price. Yet despite it all, Traore pressed forward. His speeches became rallying cries not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa as a whole. He called for Pan-African unity, urging nations like Mali and Niger to join him in a vision of self-reliance and sovereignty. His courage sparked conversations across the continent. If a small, resource-strapped nation like Burkina Faso could resist, then why couldn't others? The world began to watch closely. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a dangerous rebel. But one thing was undeniable. This young soldier had disrupted the status quo. He had shown that Africa did not have to remain silent or obedient. It could resist. It could stand tall. It could dream of freedom on its own terms. And for the people of Burkina Faso, that dream was no longer distant. Under Traore, it was finally within reach. The world expected Ibrahim Traoré to bend. They thought he would eventually soften his tone, play by the rules, and quietly return Burkina Faso to the grip of foreign influence. But they underestimated him. Instead of retreating, Traoré doubled down. One of his boldest moves came when he announced the removal of French troops from Burkina Faso forces that had been stationed there for years, under the banner of fighting terrorism. For many, these bases had become symbols of dependency, reminders that the nation was still under a colonial shadow. With a single order, Traoré told them to pack up and leave. And just like that, the tricolor flags that once flew over bases in Ouagadougou were lowered. The message was clear: Burkina Faso would no longer be a client state. The West was furious. In Paris, officials called emergency meetings. In Washington, analysts whispered that Traoré had become a dangerous figure who threatened Western influence in the Sahel, and in international headlines, his name was painted in bold letters not as a liberator, but as a radical. Yet, inside Africa, his courage was electric. He was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He had become a symbol. His speeches grew sharper. Traoré accused global powers of exploiting Africa's wealth while leaving its people in poverty. He spoke openly about how foreign corporations extracted gold, uranium, and resources while schools went unfunded and farmers went hungry. He called it what it was: neo-colonialism. And he vowed that under his leadership, Burkina Faso would chart its own course. This defiance sent shockwaves across the continent. In Mali, in Niger, and Guinea, young Africans chanted his name. Protesters held up signs with his image, calling him a brother, a leader, a voice for all who had been silenced. The idea of Pan-African unity, a dream long spoken, but rarely acted upon, was suddenly alive again. But Traoré's resistance came with consequences. Western nations began to threaten sanctions. Aid packages were frozen. International institutions questioned his legitimacy. Media outlets called him authoritarian, warning that his leadership would bring instability. It was a campaign not just of politics, but of pressure designed to break him down, to force him into submission. And yet he did not flinch. Instead, he reached out to allies outside the traditional Western sphere. New agreements were signed with countries willing to work on equal terms. Partnerships in defense, trade, and infrastructure began to emerge. The West watched in disbelief as a small nation, one of the poorest in the world, dared to realign its future without their blessing. Inside Burkina Faso, something remarkable was happening. For the first time in decades, people began to feel a sense of ownership over their destiny. Farmers saw leaders who listened to their struggles. Students saw hope in education reforms. Soldiers, once demoralized, now fought with renewed determination, believing they were defending their homeland rather than serving foreign interests. But perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Traoré stood before his people and declared that Africa's fight was not just against terrorism or poverty, it was against the chains of dependency that had held it back for generations. His voice rose with conviction as he said, "We are not slaves of the West. We are not children to be controlled. We are free and we will decide our own future. That single declaration shook the halls of power in Europe. Leaders who had grown used to silence from Africa now faced something they had not seen in decades, a young, fearless leader who refused to bow down. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than politics, it was dignity. It was proof that their voices mattered, that their country could stand tall, even when the odds were against them. And for Africa as a whole, it was a glimpse of a future where sovereignty was not a dream but a reality. As the echoes of Ibrahim Traoré's bold decisions spread across the globe, it became clear that this was not a story confined to Burkina Faso. What happened in one of Africa's smallest, often overlooked nations had unleashed a ripple effect that no one could ignore. In Tel Aviv, the shock was undeniable. Israeli firms that once saw Africa as an open frontier for business found themselves forced to reconsider. Boardrooms that had projected years of profit suddenly stared at losses, and politicians who had once boasted of strategic footholds in the Sahel now whispered about setbacks. But the true blow was not economic, it was psychological. Israel, a nation accustomed to expanding its influence through deals and partnerships, had just been told no by a country many in the West considered powerless. That precedent was dangerous, because if Burkina Faso could say no, so could others, and indeed others were watching. In Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, and beyond, whispers of resistance grew louder. Activists, students, and labor unions began demanding their leaders review foreign contracts. Citizens asked, if Traoré can reclaim his nation's dignity, why can't we? Governments that had long walked a careful line with Western powers suddenly faced pressure from their people. Traoré's actions had transformed into a continental conversation about sovereignty, independence, and pride. For the West, this was a nightmare scenario. For decades, Africa had been treated as a marketplace, a source of raw materials, cheap labor, and political leverage. But now a new generation of Africans was questioning that arrangement. And standing at the center of that awakening was a 34-year-old soldier who had refused to bow. Inside Burkina Faso, the mood was unlike anything the nation had seen since independence. Streets once filled with frustration now echoed with songs of celebration. Murals of Traoré appeared on walls. Farmers proudly claimed ownership of their lands. Market women spoke of dignity returning to their lives. Young people, who once dreamed only of escaping to Europe for a better future, now began to dream of building something at home. The symbolic power was immense. One old man told reporters, his voice breaking with emotion, "I was alive when we won independence from France. But today, for the first time, I feel truly free." His words captured the essence of this moment, that independence is not simply about raising a flag, but about taking control of your nation's destiny. But there was also danger. Traoré's defiance invited retaliation. Western governments whispered about sanctions, aid cuts, and diplomatic isolation. Media campaigns painted him as reckless, even authoritarian. The pressure was immense, and history had shown that leaders who defied global powers often paid a heavy price. And yet Traoré seemed prepared for that cost. He framed the struggle not as one nation's fight, but as Africa's collective battle against dependency. He told his people, "We are ready to suffer if it means we suffer on our own terms. Better hardship and freedom than comfort in chains." Those words became a rallying cry across the Sahel. The impact was not just political or economic, it was generational. Young Africans, scrolling through social media, saw in Traoré something they had long been searching for. A leader unafraid, a leader who believed in them. Hashtags carrying his name spread across platforms. His speeches were translated, shared, and debated in cafes and classrooms. To the youth of Africa, he wasn't just a president. He was proof that the future could be different. And so as the world watched, a question emerged. Was this the beginning of a new Africa? An Africa that no longer played by the rules written in foreign capitals, but instead carved its own path? Or was it a brief spark, destined to be extinguished by the immense weight of global pressure? Only time will tell. But one truth cannot be erased. Ibrahim Traoré had broken the silence. He had shattered the illusion that Africa must always bow to the powerful. And in doing so, he gave millions of people across the continent something priceless: hope. Hope that Africa could rise. Hope that dignity could be reclaimed. Hope that the future belonged not to outsiders but to Africans themselves. And whether the world liked it or not, that hope was already alive, burning and unstoppable. As the dust begins to settle, one truth becomes undeniable. What Ibrahim Traoré did in Burkina Faso was far bigger than shutting down a few foreign contracts. It was a declaration that Africa no longer has to play by the old rules, that dignity and sovereignty are worth more than profit, and that even the smallest of nations can stand tall against the giants of the world. Think about it, a 34-year-old soldier, once dismissed as inexperienced, now stands as the face of resistance in a continent long scarred by exploitation. With a single bold decision, he didn't just disrupt Israeli business ventures, he disrupted the very narrative of Africa's place in the global order. For Israel, it was humiliation, millions lost, influence shaken, and a painful reminder that control is never absolute. For Africa, it was inspiration, proof that leadership, rooted in courage, can ignite a movement far beyond national borders. We saw it in the streets of Ouagadougou, where farmers and market women danced with joy, chanting that their land was theirs again. We saw it in the digital world, where young Africans flooded social media with Traoré's speeches, seeing in him a reflection of their own dreams. We even saw it in the quiet whispers of other African capitals, where leaders and citizens alike asked, if Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? Yes, the risks remain. Powerful nations don't give up their influence easily. Sanctions may come, aid may be cut, attempts to discredit or destabilize Traoré may already be underway. But even if the road ahead is difficult, the symbolic victory has already been won. The world has witnessed a small, landlocked nation shake the confidence of a global power. That memory cannot be erased. And so, what began as a single act of defiance has become something much larger, a spark of hope. A hope that Africa's future doesn't have to be written in foreign boardrooms. A hope that sovereignty is not just a word in a constitution, but a living principle. A hope that dignity, once taken, can be reclaimed. In the end, this story is not just about Ibrahim Traoré. It's about the millions of Africans who see in him a path forward, a vision of freedom, of justice, of true independence. It's about rewriting the story of a continent too often defined by what others take from it, instead of what it can create for itself. And maybe that's why Traoré's name will be remembered, not simply as Africa's youngest president, not only as a defiant soldier, but as the leader who reminded the world and his people that Africa is not powerless, that Africa is not for sale, and that the time of silence is over. Because in the streets of Burkina Faso, in the voices of farmers, students, and elders, one message is already echoing: this is just the beginning. And now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Ibrahim Traoré's bold stand will inspire other African nations to rise up and reclaim their sovereignty? Or do you think the pressure from powerful countries will force him to back down? Share your thoughts below. I'll be reading and responding. But don't stop here. If this story opened your eyes, then you'll want to see what comes next. In my upcoming video, we'll dive even deeper into how global superpowers are shaping Africa's future, and how leaders like Traoré are rewriting the rules of the game. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and join me as we continue exploring the untold stories that are changing the world. Because this isn't just history. In the making, this is the future, unfolding right before our eyes.